And here we go. This is the beginning of 24 hours of essays, or actually videos on essays, on the book Uncontrolling Love. There's going to be 48 consecutive half-hour Facebook Live videos done by the contributors to this new book. And this one is the first. I'm actually going to do another, the very last part, the very last one, the 48th video, tomorrow night. So what's this all about? Well, this is all about a brand new book, as I said, called Uncontrolling Love. The subtitle is Exploring the Uncontrolling Love of God with Introductions by Thomas J. Oord. That's me. I'm Thomas J. Oord, and I'm a theologian. And it is my great honor and privilege and thrill to have this book, which has more than 80 essays, come out exploring the ideas in my previous book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. Actually, I've got copies of both of them. Here's the brand new book, the book that the folks are going to be talking about in the next 24 hours. Uncontrolling Love just came out last month, published by, actually this month, published by Sacrisage Press. Big honking book. We're talking lots of essays by theologians, scientists, philosophers, artists, activists, a bunch of pastors, students, and folks of other labels and types. The diversity is breathtaking. The ideas are eclectic, but what they're centered on are various topics and ideas that came from a book that I wrote a couple of years ago, and here's a copy of it, called, if we can get in the camera, there we go, called The Uncontrolling Love of God, an Open and Relational Account of Providence by InterVarsity Press Academic 2015. So what this newer book is doing, and the folks who are going to be doing the Facebook Live videos here in the next 24 hours, they take some of the ideas I propose and they take them in new directions, or they evaluate them in new ways, or they apply them to their own personal lives, or they apply them to important social issues, or ethical issues, or scientific issues, or philosophical issues. That's what I mean about diversity and it being eclectic. The ideas go in a lot of different directions as they build on some of the proposals I had in The Uncontrolling Love of God. So I thought, to begin this 24-hour marathon, I ought to give you a little bit of an idea of what the core notion in the Uncontrolling Love book was all about. This is the notion that lots of the other folks are going to be applying and speculating and etc. in the other videos. So if at the very beginning of this marathon I try to articulate as carefully as I can what the core idea is, that would help those of you who are going to watch lots of these videos get a better understanding of what the basic idea is as it gets applied and thought out in other ways. So the basic idea is this. God's love is the kind of love that is self-giving, others empowering, and therefore uncontrolling. Unlike some people who say that God usually doesn't control, in this particular book, I make the bold, radical, and surprising claim, at least surprising to many people, that God's love is inherently uncontrolling and that God cannot control others. Now, of course, whenever you say God can't do something, that makes a whole bunch of people nervous, because this is the God who we call Almighty, and I believe God is Almighty. This is the God who created the heavens and the earth, and I believe that too. This is a God who does miracles, and I believe that. This is a God who's the most powerful being there is, and I believe that. So how can the God who is the most powerful not be able to do something? Well, actually, if you look carefully at the Bible, there's quite a few passages that talk about things God cannot do. The author of Hebrews, for instance, talks about, says that God cannot lie. James says God cannot be tempted. The psalmist says God can't grow tired, and there are other ones. But the one that I focus on in this book is one in which Paul is writing to his protege, Timothy. And he has this really great line. Paul says, when you are faithless, when you are faithless, God remains faithful, faithful. And here's the key point, because God cannot deny himself. In other words, God cannot be other than who God is. God must be God, we might say. And I'm proposing that, at least in this book, I'm saying God's love is the kind of love that gives, it self-gives, it empowers others. And I draw upon another passage of Scripture that a lot of people know. It's in Philippians that uses the word kenosis. Kenosis is translated a whole bunch of different ways by various translators. But basically, it's the idea that God self-gives, and this is revealed in Jesus Christ. Like most Christians, I think that Jesus gives us the best picture of God's character. Jesus reveals God's heart, we might say. And if we look at Jesus as one who is self-giving and others empowering, in fact, dies on a cross, is self-sacrificing, and then we say, maybe God's love is like that as well. Always giving, always empowering, self-sacrificing even. And if we say this is God's very nature, and God can't deny God's own nature, God can't deny himself, according to Paul's letter to Timothy, then God must give to others, must empower others, and cannot control them. Now, my position stands between two positions that you can find elsewhere in the theological literature. And I want to try to carefully articulate what the differences between these two other positions. Okay, on the one side, there are a lot of Christians and Christian theologians who believe that God is kenotic, expresses kenosis, but this is a voluntary kind of thing on God's part. God could control others, and maybe sometimes does on special occasions, etc., but most of the time God is uncontrolling. I call this kenosis view voluntary self-limitation. God makes a choice to usually not control others. Now, the problem with that view, well, there's a bunch of them, but the one that I want to focus on right now and that I focus on in the book is that it doesn't help us to understand the real evils, the genuine evils that happen in the world. I mean, if God is choosing not to control when God could, it doesn't seem like God's very loving when God allows a rape or allows genocide or allows a Holocaust. The God who could control but doesn't control doesn't seem consistently loving. If you or I had the capacity to control in some way and we didn't use it, and we then allowed some horrible thing to happen, no one would say we are really loving. Why should we say the same to God? Or maybe I should put it like this. If Jesus reveals God the best, can you imagine Jesus standing by and allowing a little girl to be raped? If Jesus is right there in the situation, and Jesus has the capacity to stop that little girl from being raped, would you think it's really loving for Jesus to allow it to happen? Could you even imagine Jesus allowing it to happen? I can't. Why do we then think that God allows these things to happen? In my view, God doesn't allow them because God cannot control those who do evil deeds. Now, I told you that's the voluntary self-limitation side of things. Let me go on the other side to say the other view that mine is not. My view does not say that God is somehow in the clutches of some exterior force or principality or laws of nature, that God is like, would like to do more, but these external principalities and factors are constraining God. I don't believe that, for instance, the devil and God are on the same level and they're jockeying for position, and sometimes the devil wins out and sometimes God does, and they're co-equals. I don't believe that. My view doesn't say that there are external things that limit God. My view says that it's God's very nature of love that places these, quote, limits or constraints on God's power. In other words, because God must love, it's God's very nature, and God's love is always self-giving and others empowering, then God must give freedom and agency to not only people, but in fact, all creation. So the technical way to put what I'm saying is this: God's self-giving, others empowering love comes logically first in God's nature, logically before God's power, which means God must love. God must empower others. God cannot not love, to use the double negative. Again, I recognize that once people hear me say God can't do some things, it makes them really nervous. So let me talk about some things that a lot of theologians will affirm, even though they may not talk about very publicly. The vast majority of theologians believe that God can't do a logical contradiction. For instance, you may remember in a philosophy class, the philosophy professor asking this paradoxical question: can God make a rock so big that even God can't lift it? And this is always a stumper, because most people want to say God can do anything, but how could God make God make a rock that God couldn't lift? It doesn't make any sense. Well, the answer to that question is God can't make a rock so big that even God can't lift it, because it's a logical paradox. There are other logical paradoxes that theologians have affirmed for a long time. For instance, theologians have said God cannot both exist and not exist. Or most theologians have said God is omnipresent and God can't decide not to be in Boise, Idaho over the weekend. Or God can't decide to be 387 instead of triune. These things that God can't do reflect God's nature. They're just who God is. And biblical writers and theologians today have boldly tried to speculate about what God's nature is like. Now, for some people, that's like, okay, who are you to say who God is? Well, if you look at the scriptures and you look at the broad biblical witness, there's lots of claims about who God is and claims about who God is not. And I think the broad biblical witness strongly supports the view that God is a God of love, that God does not do evil. Now, I recognize there are a few stories here and there in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that depict God as being one who causes or allows bad things. In my view, I'll just put it bluntly, I think those writers misunderstood God. I think those portions of Scripture are wrong. And the reason I think they're wrong is because the vast majority of Scripture says that God is not like that. And perhaps even more importantly, the clearest picture of God we find in Scripture, the picture we find in Jesus Christ, depicts a God who's not the source of evil, not the one who does wrong, not the one who fails to forgive. So if I take the broad biblical witness, and especially Jesus Christ, as my primary lens for trying to understand who God is, I can begin to build a case for this idea that God's love is necessarily others empowering, self-giving, sacrificial, servant-like, and uncontrolling. And this helps me and helps others, as you will hear in these videos in the next 24 hours, make a better sense out of God and life, not only in terms of the problem of evil, but in terms of a whole host of other issues that I'm not going to go into because I'm going to let them talk about them. So if you've just joined me at this point, I started this video by saying that this is the first of 48 consecutive videos in the next 24 hours, all half-hour videos, exploring the issue of God's uncontrolling love. And the folks who are doing these videos are all contributors to this brand new book called Uncontrolling Love, Essays Exploring the Love of God with Introductions by Thomas J. Oord. And I mentioned earlier, I'm that guy. I'm Thomas J. Oord. Now, we're going to post, or it might have already been posted, I'm not sure, a schedule of all the folks who signed up and when they're going to be doing their Facebook Live videos in the next 24 hours. All of the times on the schedule are Eastern times. So beginning now, which is 7:16 Eastern time for the next 24 hours. If you look on that schedule and you see the time, just remember that's Eastern time zone. When each of us is finished doing our half-hour Facebook Live video, we are going to save it on our Facebook page, our homepage, our personal page, and then we're going to share it on a Facebook page called Conversations on the Uncontrolling Love of God. And so the idea is that these videos will all be placed there. And of course, I'm guessing no one is probably going to try to sit through the 24-hour marathon and watch every single video live. I mean, probably no one here is Facebook friends with all the contributors. So if you want to see those, go to, and you're not going to see them live, go to this Facebook page called Conversations on the Uncontrolling Love of God. And there you can see the recording and hear what people talked about. Each of them is going to be talking about their own particular essay, and they'll probably go into other areas. That's just the way these things go. But they've been asked to kind of talk about why they decided to write this essay, what kind of impact it's had in their thinking and in their lives, kind of the questions and the wrestling. I mean, nobody's got this stuff figured out. I don't have it all figured out. But the folks who are proposing these ideas and doing these Facebook Live videos and who wrote the essays in this book, they think there is maybe some ways to think about God that are better than other ways. And thinking about God's love as being inherently uncontrolling is a really good way. Now they're going to raise questions like, how do you account for miracles? What does this mean for prayer? How about science and evolution? What about LGBT stuff? How about understanding my children? Oh, I mean, they're all over the board. That's what's going to be so fun. You're not going to hear too much of the same idea. You're going to hear an idea that's a core, and then it's going to be explored, surveyed, applied in a whole realm of other possibilities. So back to my own explanation. Those of you who are just joining me, I just talked about what the core idea, essential kenosis, is that's in this book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. There's another topic I want to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so that I have left. And it's one that I think is quite perplexing. It's the question of chance and randomness. My friend Rob Grayson has had a discussion going the last couple of weeks on my book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. And I've noticed that this issue of chance and randomness is one of the most difficult for people to get their heads around. And it was actually the kind of impetus to get me to write this book, that and Question of Evil. But it was the impetus of asking the question, can we think that there are genuinely random and chance events in the world? Not only random from our perspective, but even random from the perspective of God. That's a really hard question. Folks have been wrestling with it for a long time. If you look at some of the early Christian theologians, people like Augustine or John Calvin, if you look at contemporary theologians like John Piper, for instance, those folks are really adamant. There's no such thing as randomness or chance, at least not in God's perspective. In their view, God doesn't think anything is random or chance because God is the omnipotent, sovereign cause of all things. God is the omnideterminer. God is sovereignly in control and has predestined all things. Now, there are other people who don't think that God predestined and don't think that God controls everything, but they say that nothing is truly random for God or chance for God because God already sees how everything is going to play out. God foreknows everything in advance. So the first group says God foreordains everything and foreknows everything. The second group says, no, God doesn't foreordain everything, but in some wild way, God can foreknow it. And therefore, if God really foreknows what's going to happen, it's not a chance event or random event in God's perspective. God knows it's random and chance, but God didn't determine it. I make a bold move in this book and say that what is random and chance for us may in fact be random and chance for God. That what happens at the quantum level, for instance, when there's random things occurring there, according to most physicists, those are ontologically, genuinely random, not only for us, but for God. God moves to create, but as the creation occurs, there's a kind of agency and integrity in creation such that God doesn't control, even at the quantum level, and things can happen that are random. That is, they're not entirely determined by God or entirely determined by other atoms and quantum events, etc., at the smallest level. So my perspective can affirm the broad consensus amongst contemporary physicists that there's randomness at the quantum level of reality. Now, if you know much about evolutionary biology, you'll know that in biology, there's also a strong emphasis and affirmation of random genetic mutations. I can affirm those as well. I can believe that God is creating through an evolutionary process that, in part, includes randomness, and that even God doesn't know with absolute certainty how things are going to play out, but God uses those in the creative process for the good. I can also affirm randomness in terms of just the everyday randomness in our lives. If you play Monopoly and you roll the dice, or if you get dealt a hand of cards, or if you win the lottery, those are chance and random events. And I can say they're really chance and random for us and for God. God knew all the possibilities that could have occurred, but God can't foreknow with absolute certainty exactly how it's all going to play out. Now, this is one of those ideas that also makes people nervous. What do you mean God doesn't foreknow? What do you mean God thinks they're random and chance events for God? That makes me nervous. I think it's a really valuable idea, and here's why. If there are random and chance events, truly random and chance events in the world, even at the smallest levels, this suggests that God is not controlling at any level of existence. And so when natural disasters, for instance, occur, we don't have to say, well, God must have sent that hurricane. God must have done the eclipse. God must have done the tsunami. God could have controlled those basic elements, but didn't. God allowed them. It must be a part of God's will and God's plan. No, we can say that even at those levels, God is not a controlling God. Now, God takes what occurs in our lives and in the natural world and works to squeeze good out of it. But we don't have to believe that God has predestined or even foreknown all that's going to occur with absolute certainty. God knew all the possibilities, but God doesn't cause everything to occur. So I think randomness is actually a gift. Randomness can help us to affirm God's love and God's giving of agency, self-organization, freedom, integrity to complex creatures like me and you, to less complex creatures like our dogs and cats, to even less complex creatures like cells and organisms, and even to the least complex things or entities of reality. This is a God who does not control from the top to the bottom, but, this is important, is always acting and influencing everything from top to bottom in love, in uncontrolling love. And to me at least, and to many of the people who are going to be doing these Facebook Live videos, that's a powerfully positive thing. That's a powerfully benevolent thing. It's not only loving because God is acting for our good by giving us these things, these gifts that are irrevocable according to the Apostle Paul, but also because God gives and God can't control, we don't have to blame God for the genuine evils that occur in our world. We don't have to blame God when we pray that our cancer leaves and it doesn't leave. We don't have to say, well, it must be God's will that she died. We don't have to say, God must have really wanted the Holocaust because God didn't stop all the homosexuals, Poles, Jews, Gypsies, etc., who died under Nazi regime. We don't have to say that God must endorse racism in America because God didn't stop it. No, we can say that God is a God of love, and this love necessarily empowers all. And what we do with what God gives makes all the difference in the world. We should blame the rapists, the killers, the racists, etc., for what they do, not God for, quote, allowing them to do it, because God's not that kind of God. Well, I could go on, and I have. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, well, actually, either one of them, but this is the one that the folks are going to be talking about, Uncontrolling Love. You can go on Amazon, pick it up. I think last time we saw it was like $23, $23.11, kind of a strange price. Anyway, brand new book. I really encourage you to check it out. And you can get this book, if I can get it on the screen there. I think this one is like down to $15 or maybe even less. Anyway, both these books are on Amazon, and these spell out some of the details of the ideas I've been proposing here lately. So I encourage you to get a copy. I also want to make sure that I mention some really cool events that are coming up in the next, well, I guess year, but most of them in the next 6 months or so. Beginning in September, and then moving on into, I guess it's February, there are going to be a series of parties, book launches across the United States and in the United Kingdom. The first is September 24th, right here in the little town that I'm in, Nampa, Idaho, at Real Life Community Church, 10 a.m. I'm going to be interviewing 4 of the contributors to this book, Adam Watkins, Kathy Beals, Angela Monroe, and Cameron McCown. We'd love to have you come at 10 o'clock. But then after that, I'll be in Kansas, Junction City, Kansas, in the first part of October, followed by being in Nashville at a couple of churches and a bookstore, and then down in Huntsville, Alabama, there in October. I'm going to be in Portland, Oregon later. I think that's November. I'm not pulling these things off well at the top of my head. Oh, also November, I'll be in Boston speaking and doing a book launch. All these are book launch events, which means that some of the contributors who live in the nearby area, and actually a few of them are going to fly in, they're going to also be a part of these parties, and they're going to talk about their essays at these book launch events. Anyhow, I'm sure I'm going to forget some. Cleveland, Ohio in December. I'm going to be in Leeds in the UK in February, and also some other places in the UK that are still being put together. Oh, man, I'm feeling bad because I'm sure I'm forgetting some possibilities here. Oh, we're working on a Southern California event. Anyhow, you can find that information on that website I mentioned earlier called Conversations on the Uncontrolling Love of God. It's actually a Facebook site. And you can get the dates and the times, or you can go to my Facebook page, or my website, and go up to the tab at the top that says, I think, lectures and projects, and it'll list like 30 of my next speaking engagements, and it gives you a lot of the details for these things coming up, including other places I'm speaking that aren't directly related to this Uncontrolling book launch party. So let me encourage you to come out to one of the parties and join in on the fun, hear some of the folks talking about their essays and what they're doing. Well, I see my time is up. My half hour is up. Next up is my friend Nathan Croy, who's going to talk about his essay in the book. And again, I encourage you to go to the website, or the Facebook page, Conversations on the Uncontrolling Love of God, because all of these videos, Facebook Live videos done in the next 24 hours, all 48 of them, are going to be posted there for you to view if you'd like to. It's going to be a great 24 hours. Great time to launch some good stuff. See ya.